So thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. My name is Matt McGuirk. I'm head of field engineering here at Source Defense. The topic for today's discussion is understanding PCI DSS 4.0, specifically the requirements involving eSkimming, data privacy, basically web pages that collect card data or otherwise work with it. Requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. We're very grateful and privileged today to be joined by a number of industry experts from across the field. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves here, and I'm just going to start at the top of my screen anyway. So Gil, would you mind giving us a couple words about yourself?
Yes, my name is Gil Eng. I'm an executive consultant within IBM Cybersecurity Services. I've been a QSA with IBM probably since the beginning back in February 2007 for the first version of PCI DSS.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ty, would you mind going next?
Hello, my name is Ty Huelle. I am the technical manager for Optiv PCI Advisory Services. Optiv does all things security, from risk and compliance assessments to product integration and managed services. And we rely on partners like Source Defense for specialized SaaS type services. So happy to be on this panel.
Thank you very much. Aaron, how about yourself?
My name is Aaron Getchius. I've been in PCI for 13 years. I've been a QSA for 10 years. I'm the PCI practice lead at Insight Assurance, and we're a CPA firm focusing on cybersecurity assessments and audits.
Excellent. And last but not least, Dustin.
Yes, hi. This Dustin Rich. I'm the director, the PCI practice lead here at A-Lign. I've been in this industry since the onset of the council was doing Visa KISP audits back in the day. I moved over to the line in 2016 and run a team of about 60 on the PCI side. We operate globally, so dealing with a lot of clients globally.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Like I said, an immense amount of talent and expertise on the phone call. Once again, a little bit more about me. My name is Matt McGuirk. I'm our head of field engineering, meaning anything where our technology is presented out in the world is my responsibility. I've been with this company for about 6 years, so I've seen all of our business, all of our deployments, and I spent about 15 years in web application development prior to that, which is a long way of saying that I should be pretty well versed in the subject matter and these requirements I saw kind of come to light and be built and so, et cetera. So you guys are obviously the expert talent, but I hope to be able to contribute just a little bit as well. In terms of agenda here, what we're going to do is just about 5 or 10 minutes of review on the problem statement for the group. I'm sure most of the folks on the phone are more than familiar with this by this point, but of course it's useful just to have that common language between us, and then we'll open it up for Q&A with the audience, as well as some guided discussion topics. So to our audience, thank you again for attending. If you have any questions, feel free to start using that Q&A function here in Zoom, and we'll take those as they come. So just a few more minutes on exactly what we're talking about here with PCI DSS 4.0.1 now, actually, and requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. So let's get started. The focus here on these two requirements is what I would call web application client-side security. So what I mean by client-side security is focusing on the code that is inside of web pages, sometimes called the front end of a web application, where credit card data is present. So this is distinct from server-side security. So things like a web application firewall or TLS SSL or at-rest encryption or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is a different area of expertise. It is certainly very important and is covered in a number of areas of the data security standard. However, requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1 are about stuff that runs inside of web pages, client-side security. The root cause and the inspiration, if you will, for these requirements is the JavaScript programming language. It is what makes everything within a web page interactive, from simple animations to very complex application level development. So as you may be aware, you can run Photoshop inside of a web browser now. Things are drastically different than they were 30 years ago when web development's first kind of got its feet in the ground. Every single website on the internet within reason uses JavaScript. As of right now, it is basically the only way to write website application code in the front end. And the real flaw, the real root cause of all of this is that JavaScript has no inherent security model within the browser. There's no notion of permission or control or even really reporting by default out of the browser about what the front end of a web application does. Because of that, it's a very ripe area for exploitation by attackers because it gives them an immense toolkit to work with from within the browser. There are a number of attacks that you may have heard of or maybe experienced yourself, unfortunately, or et cetera, or seen in the security trades that take advantage of this technique. MageCart is the kind of security industry branded terminology, if you will. It comes from the words Magento, an e-commerce platform, and shopping cart, the area of that platform in which this technique was kind of popularized, if you will. PCI uses the terms eSkimming throughout its documentation, but you may have also heard the terms form jacking, credential harvesting, click jacking, a handful of others. But those all fall under the umbrella of client-side attack or client-side security. So if you're looking for a generic term, that's where you would land. We're talking about client-side JavaScript. Let's talk about a few examples of what that stuff is. So basically, we're talking about two things. First, what I would call first-party JavaScript. First-party JavaScript is what an organization, I'm just going to start using the word merchant in this context, although it could be a payment service provider or really anybody else who's got a web page, but a merchant would write themselves. So that's what I would call first-party code, meaning that you're writing a web app, you've got application developers, you maybe integrate other code into your website directly, but this is code that the merchant owns. They have responsibility and control over it. The other category I would describe as third-party JavaScript. So these are things like marketing integrations or telemetry tools sometimes, or analytics tools, et cetera. So different pieces of software that are integrated into the web page that essentially a merchant isn't going to, develop themselves. There's no business reason to write your own analytics software when you can go get Google Analytics for a reasonable amount of money. The issue there is that the merchant is exposing their visitors to that code that's dragged in on the fly. And due to that lack of a permission model, that can cause a number of issues, which I'll describe in greater depth as we go. A supply chain is an aspect of this, the notion of a supply chain. It's a little bit different than when we think of the term supply chain attack in other contexts in security. So, SolarWinds, for instance, where we're integrating an appliance or service deeply into the entire org, and then that's used as a vector into the organization. It's a similar concept here, except the supply chain is dynamic and happens inside of the web browser at the time the page is loaded, and also deals with a shifting kind of network of responsibilities. So in this example I have on the screen, a merchant may install Google Tag Manager in their web pages, which is a tool that makes it easy for a non-technical user to integrate other tools. Those tools might then call in during an average web page session a number of other tools dynamically. So, don't think of this like a library dependency that gets called in. It's much more like the code calls in a full-blown application. So in this particular case that I'm showing you here, this merchant may be very informed of these relationships that they have with New Relic or Facebook or et cetera. However, they may be unaware that something like Taboola is loading a tool like Solvi, which is loading its own analytics tools. So now I have a third and a fourth and a fifth party relationship that has established itself in the browser on the fly, which is why this can be very tricky. And as we'll talk more about the specific wording of the requirements, but that's a lot of the reason why inventory and authorization and justification are part of the equation at this point. I want to show you just a quick practical example of what a simulated attack looks like. So this is the New York Times for no particular reason. It's just a generic website. It has a full featured front end. It's got advertising in it, and et cetera. So it's a good illustration of a pretty dynamic and modern web application. If you look here, I just opened up the development tools in Google Chrome. And this will be the most technical thing that I do, so don't stress too much at anybody who's not a technical user. All I'm trying to illustrate here is that there's a huge amount of JavaScript code that's loaded into my browser. Some of it certainly is originated at the New York Times. It's first-party JavaScript. It's what they can control. And it still needs to be inventoried and considered in this context and everything else. But there is an immense amount of third-party code here, code that is now running inside of my web browser because of the way this web page is architected. Basically, it calls in all this stuff by reference. So this is all running here. It was sourced from other servers on the internet that the Times can't control. And so therefore, it introduces an immense amount of risk. Now, if there is an attack somewhere in the supply chain, I'm going to simulate that here in a second. And I do want to underline that word simulation. All I'm doing is manipulating the network traffic to and from my specific web browser. Nothing's been done to the New York Times domain or their servers. However, if a supply chain attack were to take place and some malicious code were to sneak into that web page that we were interacting with, something like this could happen. So this is my demonstration attack. Now, in the real world, these attacks are silent. They don't have a black and green terminal window that pops up to show you what's going on. However, for the sake of illustration, mine does. So what we can see here is that the attack has kind of sprung into action as I began to log into the New York Times website. You can see with no problem whatsoever, the malicious code can grab whatever keystrokes it wants, whatever data. When I click continue here, I think this is probably the most salient or interesting part of this, in my opinion, which is that the JavaScript code can go beyond just skimming. It can manipulate what the web page looks like, how it behaves, what it shows to the visitor. And in this case, it has been exploited. It has been used to introduce this form that is not normally here when someone tries to log into their New York Times account. So this is an example of what I would call form jacking. Where the attacker is simply asking for payment card details before the user logs in at some place where the user might expect to enter personal data. So basically social engineering combined with this kind of client-side attack. And the reason I point this out, particularly in the context of PCI DSS, is that a lot of the folks on the phone may have noticed that the requirements expanded from 3.2, where a payment service provider might have put them, or excuse me, a merchant may have put themselves entirely out of scope by using an iframe embedded into a web page from a payment service provider. Well, this kind of attack is why in 4.0, those pages are now back in scope, meaning that if the attacker can manipulate the page into which the iframe is embedded, then everybody's in trouble. So when I click proceed to my account here, we can see that that information is going to be sent somewhere else. And then the attack is successful. My particular demonstration forwards us back to a contact us page because I don't want to interact with the Times website in any interesting way here. But in reality, consider that the attacker could simply allow the visitor to continue with their business. And so there's no evidence to the visitor that anything has happened. Likewise, there's no evidence for the Times. This all just happened out in internet land in my web browser. So there's no reason that there's no audit log or something like that for them to investigate. That's why these attacks are so pernicious and so persistent. Let's have so much dwell time and so much repeat rate. So very briefly, to set the stage, the DSS requirements for this are, like we mentioned, 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. I won't read them to you chapter and verse, but of course, my guests on the phone have these memorized more or less. Actually, at this point I do too, but anyway, the general theme of these things, 6.4.3 and 11.6.1, usually I distill these down to 4 different tasks that a merchant must perform. You have to have an inventory of your payment page JavaScript. You have to have you have to have a reason that it's authorized to be there and have a written justification for that. You have to have a mechanism to verify the integrity of the scripts, the contents of the payment page, and you also have to have a way to monitor what are called HTTP response headers, which is the metadata that the server sends to the browser along with the contents of the page. So it's those 4 things, in my opinion, that the most succinct way to state those. But of course, we're going to go into more detail here over the course of our conversation. So with that, I think I'll pivot it. We've all heard enough from me. I think I'll pivot here into some questions and some discussion. Let me see what's come up here through the Q&A, and I'll also grab something here. Yeah, and I've got a couple interesting ones here. About scope, I think that's where I want to start. So if anybody can take this, but would you be willing to delve into the relationship between the payment service provider, their iframe, and the payment page? So like who's got responsibility there? And then the second thing is, what if a payment page redirects fully to a third party? So those questions about scope are different in 4.0, and who wants to take a stab at that one? Ty, please.
I'll go ahead. So scoping is very important, right? We all know that we can shed scope on how many requirements we got to look at based on what kind of business channels you have in your environment. So this one being focused on e-commerce, Traditionally with 321, you had an iframe and you outsourced the payment page to the payment provider. You could basically say, hey, we outsourced all our payment pages. Well, now if you got any kind of administrative capability on a web server platform with an iframe or a redirection link, now you need a product like Source Defense to do this. But I would say if somebody has fully outsourced, meaning they have no access to content or administrative access to content or to administering that web server, and they trust now a third-party service provider to fully administer that, then you better at least make sure they have a tool when you go through your 12.8 requirements and you're validating their AOCs along with their roles and responsibilities matrix. You want to make sure that they've got full capability and coverage and that your website has that kind of tool on there, and that they are going to also alert you if there's an incident, which is the 12.10 requirements. So hopefully that kind of clears some things up from scoping, whether or not this really falls into my wheelhouse or not. But yeah, you at least have some kind of responsibility.
Yeah, and let me just back that up. The applicability notes in the standard or in the guidance doc are pretty clear. If you focus on that, if you have questions around that, the organizations that have iframes still have a responsibility to manage any scripts around their referring site, what's controlling that HTML. The delineation is, and it's pretty clear in there, though, the third-party service provider you're pointing to in that iframe, you don't necessarily have to manage their scripts. So you're going to have to identify those because more than likely they may come up if you're monitoring, but to know what their scripts are, they're ultimately responsible for managing those. And part of your validation of that third party is making sure they're following that they have controls in place to meet that. But more than likely, your organization as well will have scripts around those referring sites of the payment pages that you'll need to manage and monitor. So getting familiar, the great thing about this requirement is people have visibility. Before, I think there was a lot of unknown to what scripts were running where, and now people are going to have visibility. And this requirement was really needed to combat the issues we've seen over the last 10 years. So I think it'll have a big impact on improving or reducing the amount of attacks associated to this. It's still taking some time. Not everybody, most people haven't implemented the controls yet. So we're just on the verge of getting there. We're going to see big improvements. There's a lot of changes within the standard. We see that every iteration of major revision. Sometimes we look at some changes and we go, is this really worth it? Why did they change that? Why are they making this so hard? This requirement is requiring either technologies or changes in your organization, but it's one of those that has the biggest impact to help you and protect your site. It's a big problem out there. We're seeing it every day. We get calls from prospects that just had a call from their bank and they were unaware of all this risk and found out, they went through a forensic and now have to go through an audit. And we're seeing this, constantly out there in the field. So it'll be great to see this get addressed properly and organizations having visibility, being able to manage the scripts around their environment, knowing what's there, being able to react more quickly when a problem pops up. All this will be great. So although this is a burden and organizations are going to have to go implement controls, this is one I wouldn't complain about. This is one that really is going to protect you and help you manage that risk better.
And I just wanted to add on that, in short, if you qualify for a SAC A because you use an iframe or you're doing a full redirect to a different payment page, these requirements are in the SAC A. They are applicable to you. And to add on to what Ty said, if you're outsourcing the payment page and you don't have access to your own payment page or your own website, they are still applicable. It's just if the service provider has an AOC and they're PCI compliant, those requirements in your report will be in place, the responsibility of the service provider. You may run into issues. We've had customers run into issues where they are outsourcing their entire website to a third party, but they're not compliant. So that means that that entity would have to undergo the assessment as if, well, they would just have to go through the assessment with you.
Yeah, and so what we're seeing in this year especially is people are going through the 4.0 requirements, but it's an evolving requirement. So this is the year you can kind of get away with both, right? Like you can get away with not having the tool because it's considered best practice, but come March 31st, 2025, now there's no excuses. Everybody has to be compliant. And hopefully we're going to see if they're relying on a third party, like Aaron was saying, that they actually have the tools implemented and they are saying, yes, I've got full responsibility for 643 and 1161. Otherwise, you got it. You got to show that compliance somehow, some way. So yeah.
I think that was thank you guys. That was the level of detail, and I think the level of nuance. Although these things do boil down. The scope is I think Aaron, you said it very well. If you're completing the SAQ, you got pages that can collect card data, kind of irrespective of how that's implemented in specific, you have scope. And then it's a matter of, sometimes you have fine HTML products that are coming out of your org and are payments facilitated through them. I got a question here. I think I'll just answer this one because it's from my web app experience, but and you guys can tell me if I'm wrong. Is the scenario the same if you have a mobile app as it is for a web page, and compliance requirements around the ability to protect the payment entry field? And so in my understanding of, the universe, if the merchant has a native iOS or Android or other application that is written in C# or Go or whatever, and it's totally native code that runs in there, you wouldn't have scope for 643 and 1161, at least because there's no web pages, right? There is a case that's pretty common, a design pattern in mobile application development, wherein the mobile app is really just a wrapper around a web page, around a web browser.
Yeah, it's a browser.
Exactly. So in that case, you certainly do have again, like I said before, if you've got an HTML document and it's getting served out somewhere and has card data in it, then that's the scope. So purely native mobile, I'm sure there's applicability for a purely native mobile application in other parts of DSS. Don't get me wrong, but for the web page stuff, no. Would you guys say, am I off base with that, guys?
You're exactly right. Yeah, it's knowing your application. If your application functions as a browser, it requires on browser elements to present, like pulling from the site to build that page, then essentially it's in scope. What it's building, all this applies. There needs to be a way to monitor that. So if that's through Safari, whatever browser, it's being supported there to ensure that's being protected. So the same attack surface is still there if it's executing in the browser.
Excellent. Okay, cool. Couple more questions. These are interesting because under the general theme of kind of evidence and collecting data to answer to these controls and these requirements. So the question here is, can you share an example or a draft of what a script inventory would look like? And I'm not going to ask us to do a live exercise there, but what would you guys expect to see evidence-wise from a merchant to support the box checking saying, yeah, we've done this? If you ask for a script inventory, what would a reasonable expectation be in your opinion?
I would say reasonably an Excel sheet, dump the scripts in there and the justifications associated with them. And then from our end, we would want to look at the payment page, the payment surface, and make sure that all the scripts are accounted for. And yeah, I mean, the problem that I've seen so far is, what do these customers do when they see a script that's looking at a lot more than they thought it would? Like, why does this analytics script need to see cardholder data in the CVV? Like, that poses a problem. Then does it really need to see that? How are you going to control it now? Like, do you get rid of the script? Do you try to control what it can look at? There's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah.
What I would say with Aaron's response there, I would totally accept that as an Excel spreadsheet or whatever, but you're gonna get me to put my hat on a little bit, and I'm gonna get a little bit more into the details, and I'm gonna do things like look at the website and and run those scripts and make sure that that matches up, right? Whereas I'd be more willing to accept evidence from an integrated tool like a source defense type scenario where it shows, hey, we're monitoring, we're seeing all these things happening. Essentially, now they're using a tool that's scanning for vulnerabilities or scanning for these scripts, scanning and creating these inventories, right? So I'm more willing to trust something where I know the tool and I see that it was implemented and configured correctly. Then that's a lot less work for me, a lot less work for the customer, a lot less work all around. But at the end of the day, if they want to do it on Excel spreadsheet, I'll get in the trenches with them, and we'll start inspecting code, or we'll run a tool like the source defense scanner against it if they're willing, right? To run it and see if we see any discrepancies, and we got some remediation we got to do, right? So, or maybe not. I don't know. Maybe you guys got a good handle on it, but I from what I've seen, it's been pretty challenging for those customers handling it manually.
Yeah, the
Absolutely.
presentation piece of it, yeah, it could be in a spreadsheet. Somebody to have a manual method to track that in a spreadsheet. The question is, how are they identifying? How are they inventorying? Are they just going to their developers and saying, what are our scripts and writing that down in a spreadsheet? So how are you really capturing what is loading in the browser? So the mechanism of how you're obtaining that information becomes really important to make sure it is accurate, and then you're going through proper authorizations. Um, and the way this standard's written, it really focuses on that to enable you to really be able to manage this, to identify, have the ability to identify and then vet the scripts. Part of this is making sure that these scripts are really justified. Is there a business purpose for this risk? Because it is any scripts out there you include that are being pulled into the browser is adding attack surface.
Yeah.
So you need to look at it from that perspective. Is it worth this risk? Is there a business justification, a business need for this? And if the answer is yes, yeah, then you go through the process and justify them. But most organizations don't have that method currently, and
Yeah.
developers will just throw scripts in for functionality, and nobody's really vetting them like they should. And I think this process is going to help a lot with that.
Absolutely. So to Dustin's point there, if you're exporting it to like a spreadsheet or Excel, I'm gonna interview you guys, right? I mean, it's gonna be a QSA's job right there is to interview and observe the control. And if we don't have, if you guys can't answer why that script is on your website, or what's the business purpose, or what's the function there, I'm going to have a challenge with that, right? As a QSA, right? Whereas if you're using a tool and it's walking you through the process and it can already identify you, hey, this is Google Analytics, it does this for your website. And you check off and say, okay, I got it, I know what it's doing. I'm pretty good with that kind of description, right? You just have to say, yes, I get it, I know what it's doing. But if you're giving me something on a spreadsheet that looks like a manual process, I'm going to say, hey, what is it? What is it doing here? So just
I think that's really
food
well
for thought.
articulated. Yeah. And I think one other challenge to underscore here is I think when I'm thinking through you guys might put more scrutiny on getting the Excel spreadsheet, right? Because you're going to ask, where did this come from? When was it updated? Who was involved in that? What's the procedure to keep it fresh moving forward? The challenge with this stuff for me on the technical side is that list I showed before on the screen of script files, that's going to change within reason, every single time the browser loads that page, maybe because of cache busting techniques. What I mean is the server on the other side of those requests changes the file when it happens. Google serves it from a different part of their infrastructure. So the domain name's different, whatever. So, I think, if I can be a little critical of the Security Council on this one, this inventorying requirement is way easier to satisfy for first party stuff. Theoretically, you should know where all your developers are, what code they're putting in there, and et cetera. Ty, you made a great example of I spent 15 years in web dev. We did whatever we wanted and didn't tell anybody. We just did it. But theoretically, you can get controls around that, right? You can say, hey, devs, make sure that you tell me what the code is and where it is. You can't do that for third parties, right? That's just going to be a dynamic, shifting kind of amorphous thing. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in inventory and actual control kind of auditing, like how good is a spreadsheet from 3 months ago that has the scripts in it. We have a couple of questions here about integrity. because integrity is we kind of glanced at authorization and inventory. Integrity is the next one up. They're asking, how do you validate the integrity of scripts? And secondly, how could one validate the integrity of a script with Microsoft Excel, which is a great question. So anyone want to take a stab at integrity for client-side JavaScript?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to claim I'm the expert at it, but I've worked with a few. We're similar. I think it was mentioned earlier, where a lot of organizations are still working through implementing these controls, figuring out which solutions, or if they build it themselves or use a third party. I go to my team. I mentioned I have like a team of like 60 working on audits every day. And when I ask them, I mean, I think we maybe had 2 instances of projects where they've actually implemented this. So a lot of them are still a work in progress. So we're anxious to see what a lot of clients do, but we do have clients inquiring, and we have some that are inquiring about even building their own kind of solution using the SRI and CSP. And I think it's sitting down and just thinking through and understanding how they're going to put this together to be able to meet the intent. And that's through the inventory authorization and being able to respond quickly. But when you get into those third-party layers, tertiary layers of scripts within scripts, do they have the ability to manage and monitor that as well? I think whatever solution you're looking at, that's going to be a good question, is how do I manage that? How do I go through the process of vetting and justifying that? And I think that'll be something we're going to learn as more people go to implement these controls, and clients implementing their own solution, and how well they can do that. It's still a little unknown to us because we haven't seen a lot of it.
Yeah, it's going to be a year of interesting discovery, right? Gil, I saw you come off mute there for a second. Do you want to weigh in on this topic?
Yeah, just a little bit. I mean, can it be done with Excel? So what's your risk appetite for your organization, right? So it can't really be done that well with an Excel spreadsheet for sure, because it's such a dynamic environment. And then on top of that, if you're doing something like CSP, it's just too much of a heavy lift to maintain that list. And so, there's a couple of things that have to be considered for anybody that needs to meet these requirements. Is how much scope reduction can we have with this? Can we offload as much as we can to a third party? And then, the SAQA, as mentioned before, does have some sort of scope, thankfully, because, we do want, I think the council is trying to address like minimizing the risk of malicious software eSkimming on the e-commerce site. So I think, just based on we don't want any risk, well, then you're going to need a tool such as Source Defense to do it. If an organization is more open to some risk, which nowadays isn't really, you shouldn't be, but yeah, you can try and manage it with Excel spreadsheet, and it's just a big.
I think that's well said. Yeah, and maybe I can hop in here and frame the content security policy and sub-resource integrity technologies. So basically, content security policy is a whitelisting, blacklisting technique where an organization would identify all the script files that, like we saw before, define those and put a configuration file basically on the web server, and to instruct the web browser about where they're allowed to host code, and where the browser is allowed to retrieve code from and execute it. So that's your whitelisting, blacklisting. Sub-resource integrity is its cousin or counterpart then, and basically it's a checksumming, hashing, signature kind of approach, wherein an organization, a merchant, would generate a set of hashes, really fingerprints for the different files. And then again, that gets served to the browser. The browser then is only allowed to load copies of those files that are valid that where the checksums match, where the fingerprints are valid. So that handles in case the file changes. So the word integrity in DSS is across the document overall is used in about like 6 different ways. And I think that the idea of integrity here gets conflated, obviously, because sub-resource integrity is in the guidance, is in the suggested technologies. So the challenge that I've seen folks hit with CSP and SRI, as the group has said very eloquently here, is administrative and actually like practical, like doesn't work. The things that I've seen is that the CSP policies become so broadly defined, like they just become like allow all. So it's a little bit like you install deadbolts across your entire business and then you never lock them, or you give out keys to everyone is actually maybe a better analysis. The thing with sub-resource integrity is that you need to have a valid hash of the file or it won't load in the browser. And so what that means is that anytime any file changes, you have a great opportunity for the front end of the web app to simply break. And so what that means with third-party code in particular, which changes all the time, either because the vendor releases a new version or those techniques I mentioned like cache busting, or they bake in a user token at the time of request. These files are dynamic. They're not like just a text file. They're an API endpoint is actually a better way to think of them in some ways. That spits out a file. And so how do you hash something that changes all the time? So that's really difficult to do in front-end JavaScript using a strict file differential or hashing technique. The guidance does call out the third option being a proprietary tag management system, tag being slang for JavaScript in this case, to prevent the execution of malicious code, which is where vendor software like Source Defense Ourselves or et cetera would fall into place. And what I've seen in that space, both ourselves, maybe others, is kind of a behavioral approach, looking at what the scripts do as they execute rather than just the contents of the files if they've changed. To give some actual insight, like we've said before, about is this file accessing a CVV? And does it actually need to do that? Is that a thing that should happen? And if that does start to happen, then sending an alert, so on and so forth. So CSP and SRI, script integrity validation, and et cetera, there's guidance in DSS about how to do that. And you have a number of choices in front of you as a merchant. And yeah, and the takeaway, I think, like we've all said, is consider the total cost of ownership of the thing. Like we're in August right now. If you're going to be auditing in the next few months, do you have a team who can spend the next 6 months or something implementing that kind of solution in-house? That's tough. It's tough to do. So here's a question.
I was just
is
gonna
a
say to
pure
that,
yeah, go ahead, Ty, please.
I was just going to say to that point, I mean, you really got to look at it. It's not even a matter of rolling in a tool. It's the weekly maintenance, right? And I mean, that's the expected stuff. I mean, the TRA may have a justification to do it even more frequently as far as how often you're checking those integrity reports or checking those tools or whatever type of stuff. So you really need to say, is it more expensive for me to buy a tool or to hire a resource that's dedicated to managing this on a weekly basis or whatever your frequency is? And so those are real things that you should be thinking about, or completely outsourcing, right? So yeah, I mean, so I think more times out of not, you'll find that a tool is the quicker route because you still even have to manage that resource, and that's a cost too. So
yeah, and we haven't even talked about the HTTP header part of it,
yeah.
which is literally just occurred to me. So for anyone on the phone who's not intimately familiar with the hypertext transfer protocol, when the web browser asks a web server for content, 2 things get sent back over the network connection. You get the contents of the web page, which is all that stuff, all those images and everything else. And you get what are called headers, which is like metadata. We don't see it as a visitor when we're interacting with the page, the website, but it does influence how the thing works. So anyway, the DSS says that you have to monitor these things because they can contain security features. But what occurred to me as we were speaking is that there really isn't there's no like CSP or SRI for headers. There isn't some technology that you could turn on in the stack that you haven't turned on yet. Your team will need to figure out some way to do that. And I've heard folks about starting to engineer around that. It's not an unsurmountable problem by any stretch of the imagination. These things boil down to text and they need to be compared and et cetera. But it literally just occurred to me, there's no kind of native spec-based off-the-shelf thing that they can go pull. So as everyone's looking at their scope and how they're going to approach this, I would urge you to consider that through too, because you might have to do something a little unusual or people don't ask to monitor web headers a lot. It just doesn't really come up at dinner party conversations. That's what I'm trying to get at. Redirects are a common theme on these phone calls. I've done a few of them at this point. So what we're talking about here are cases where the merchant has implemented what I would call hosted payment page solution. They have a shopping cart experience, for instance. They click on checkout and they're fully redirected to a payment service provider where the transaction takes place, and then the visitor is redirected back to the merchant's website. So there's been some ambiguity on this topic about where's the scope, who owns it, do they have to do something for 643 and 1161? I'm curious what this team here thinks of it, and if anyone wants to take a stance on this one.
I would say it's the responsibility of the merchant and the service provider, but you can only control what you can control. So the merchant is responsible for the scripts on their page. Service provider is going to be responsible for the scripts on their payment page. So like, even though you're hitting checkout and you're going to a completely different web page, like Stripe, probably the most prevalent, you hit the checkout and then you're fully redirected to the Stripe payment page. Stripe has their own responsibilities. You have your responsibility with that page that has the checkout button that has that redirect.
Yeah, I would even so I would look at the control from an intent. What's the business actually trying to do, and how are they using their web server, right? So if their web server is external facing, looks like an e-commerce page, or it's walking them through products, and then there's a redirect to a payment cart, by all means, you should have that tool, because anybody can redirect you to their website, their hacker website, or whatever for that type of stuff. If it was more of a internal call center using a payment provider's web page, because it's just, hey, we click on this link and we're on the payment provider web page, and now as we get calls, we navigate to the product and then we enter it for them, or we navigate through a Shopify website that's fully exported type of thing, and all we got is shopify.com, but we got to log into it, type of thing, then I would say no, right? Because that's more of an internal type of scenario, and it's an internal resource, and it's a call center, and that third-party service provider should have your tool or have a tool like that for their payment process and their payment provider link in that kind of scenario. I don't know if that makes sense to the team or not, but that's
that
the way
makes
I kind of
sense.
see it.
Yep. And I think that's key there is if you're fully outsourcing, your responsibility is ensuring that organization you're outsourcing to is meeting the intent and fully owning that.
Yep.
That's going to be on them, even if you're using it, especially if you're using it like in a call center's data entry, because then you do have direct exposure to in your browsers, and you don't have control of preventing that. It's going to be your service provider. So you're really reliant on them meeting that control.
Yeah, and it really depends. I mean, that I remember back in the day, guys, the council's like, is it in scope or not in scope? And the trainer will always say, it depends. And Ty, you did bring it up. I mean, is it a call center? Are they entering the cardholder data strictly on the service provider website? And then you brought it up, Dustin, where are you entering this cardholder data, but you have some of the code to do some of the redirect? Yeah, you're going to be in scope because you have administrative access to that code. So again, I hated that answer at that time, but now as we've gone through and matured in this industry, it really does depend on the implementation.
Yeah, Matt, you said something earlier was like fingernails on a chalkboard to me in most QSAs. You mentioned something about 321 or 32 that how we redirect, so we didn't have scope. That's a common misconception. We hear it all the time. It's QSAs, and we have to take a step back. You're in scope if you redirect, regardless. What that scope is going to be greatly reduced by how you redirect, but you are in scope. That concept of not in scope always makes us a little weary, because that means they think they don't need to do anything, and there are responsibilities there and risks. And so 4.0 did not bring it in scope. What it did is increased what is required around that scope to protect ourselves from the latest threats.
That's very well stated, and that's
Well
why I
done.
invite you guys so that you can call out that exact. Yeah, I was inaccurate. It's that expansion, and I think the theme of intent here is super important because what I've heard from merchants or anybody else in scope for this stuff, like with the redirect issue in specific, is that sometimes you get this kind of contagion idea where it's like, okay, this page redirects, but this page before it leads to that page, and then the whole website seems like it's in scope, and et cetera, et cetera. And at least philosophically, or the spirit of the thing, I don't think is that. It's not that like, yes, because the World Wide Web is a collection of web pages, that everything forever is in scope. It's that when the user, like we saw in that demo, when the user goes through a reasonable process to purchase a good that will end up in entering a credit card number, you need to make sure that your part that you own that is facilitating that thing is not going to be exploited to steal their payment information is how I interpret it anyway. And like the practical security, what are we trying to solve for sort of thing.
Just to go back to what I was saying earlier, a lot of times that redirection link, you'll find they're embedded in like mainframe apps, or they're just a browser bookmark, right? Type of thing that the call center is using. That's what I normally see. But back to Gil's point is the whole depends type of thing. It's when I start seeing those servers, right? It's a web server with a link in it. Then I'm really kind of going through there and understanding the business process flow and what's going on here. Does this look more and smell like an e-commerce thing, or is it just a bunch of links? But even so, I'm probably going to lean towards that server needs to be hardened and so forth. And are you standing up a web server instance, right? In a browser, to where you're feeding me a browser now, and I'm not just clicking on a link or a button anymore. So those are the things that I have to sit there and process as a QSA as to whether or not that system's in scope.
Excellent. Well, so I've heard the joke. If you ask two QSAs a question, you'll get four answers. So I think we're closer to clarity on the redirect thing as we get, and then of course the proofs in the pudding when the assessments start to come through. But like I said, at least as far as I'm concerned, it's make sure you're doing right by your visitors and your constituents per the application as you have designed it. Here's an interesting one about frequency or scope. So in 11.6.1. There is a actual time-based requirement, like a definition of how often people should be looking at the HTTP headers. And it was interestingly enough changed from once a week to once every 7 days. Like they very specifically changed the language in a way that, as an English major, kind of wrangled me in 4.0.1. Doesn't matter. Point is that there's frequency in 11.6.1 about a week, business week, to check the headers. I don't see any kind of frequency in 6.4.3 in my reading. What do you guys think is a reasonable, like, you're looking at the script inventory and you're et cetera. I don't want to make you make a ruling on it or anything, but given that there's no guidance in there, what's like a compass direction to go in, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I think the interpretation when it says for to monitor what's executing in the browser, the question is, does that mean real time or is it once a week, once a month? I think the closer you get to real time, the more protected you're going to be. I have some worries about organizations that just do periodic checks and not looking at every execution because sites operate differently globally in different regions, different language packs, maybe different distribution servers, the different scripts. You may be missing something if you're just spot checking. And that's something probably organizations should build into their own kind of risk assessment and how they implement these controls.
Yeah, I would have a challenge, obviously, if we're looking at the integrity because of 11.6.1, and there's a TRA requirement or a periodic, requirement, I would say always go more than what the standard is. So if they're calling for a week, if you can go more and closer to real time, then you may be able to avoid doing the TRA for it, right? But when it comes to the 6.4.3, I'm like, if you're already touching that web server and you're checking things, chances are, like your tool for source defense, you're checking it all right there just by by using the tool and using the dashboard, right? You're monitoring it. So And I feel like that's all a part of integrity, right? It's not just about the headers, in my opinion. So I do feel like, you know, if I was to see the customer scrambling around annually to validate and check scripts and check that kind of stuff, I would be like, this is not a maintenance control, and I would be a little, you know, more on the forceful side, like you really need to get this done, and I need to see some assurance or some procedure that you're changing this process, and now you have a written documented methodology or operational procedure to check this, you know, at least weekly or something, and I would make it aligned with the 1161.
You're saying if you
I think
see
they're one
a
and the same. I think they're one and the same, to be honest. I mean, I don't know how you can do one without the other, really. I mean, I don't know.
if you're getting an Excel spreadsheet with a last modified date of March 30th at 11:59 p.m.,
Yeah,
that's going to invite additional scrutiny. It's kind of what I'm gathering from that.
I'm gonna just ask for additional document controls to show that they're gonna update this in the next week or so.
It makes
Yeah,
sense. Yeah.
and it's not, and I can tell you as QSAs, it's not about looking at that and saying, no, that's not right, we're failing. It's educating them on this risk. They're implementing a control and actually going through the energy of implementing something, but it's not really giving them a lot of protection if they go 8 months, 10 months throughout the year without knowing what's executing. And so they got a huge exposure still. So now you're doing this work and you're still, if you have an issue, you're probably going to find out about it through the bank, not your tool. So it's educating them on that. And this is an important requirement. It's one you want to pay attention to and implement correctly.
Yeah.
And as far as timing on 643, I mean, there's policies and procedures that are required around 643. So not only do we need to review the policies and procedures, we need to make sure that the output is expected. So if you say you're going to do it each release, you're going to review the scripts each release and make sure that they're justified. You know, that's what we're going to be looking for. So a lot of it is up to you and your risk tolerance, but there's also a reasonableness factor in here that if you're checking it once a year, that's not good enough. You know, your website is changing more often than that. So if your website changes, you should be looking back through. If you're doing it manually, or if you're using a tool like Source Defense, it makes it easy and it, you know, monitors it for you. And I haven't seen any customer be compliant in managing scripts and the payment page integrity manually. It's always been with a tool. I had one customer who said they spent 6 months trying to inventory all the scripts on their payment pages and authorizing them and seeing what they're looking at, and they're still not done. Then I asked them how they were doing with 11.6.1, and they said, "What's 11.6.1?"
That's
I mean, there's just it's an incredible amount of work, and it's you know, you may not have to buy a tool if you're going to attempt it manually, but I think the resource cost is much more than, you know, purchasing a tool that is specifically made to help you comply with 643 and 11.6.1.
What Matt said earlier around that's really important because we see that in the industry all the time. Anything you do internally, you tend to go to the point of least resistance. So if you're afraid something you're doing might break the site, you're going to open it up and allow everything through. So now you just created a logging tool, and that's all it's doing. You still got to monitor that and react to it. And a lot of times doing it in-house, you're not getting the details. You don't see a lot of these people developing it themselves, not seeing the details of what that change was, what is it doing. A lot of these third-party tools, because they're vetting it through hundreds of customers, they're creating all that functionality. And so there's big advantages and takes the headache away trying to build this ad hoc to using a tool that's being used by a lot of different customers and big customers that are going to properly help vet that to make sure and you benefit from it. So
I think that, yeah, CSP and SRI, you know, obviously I'm from a vendor, so I'll take this with a grain of salt, but I think they are well-intentioned technologies. What I mean by that is like the people who wrote them into the web spec, the World Wide Web Consortium, like had a use case that they work for, which is basically, you know, if you have a very simple like time card. Let's imagine a time card punch clock application that sits on an intranet. You know, employees log into it, they click, yep, I'm here today, and then it logs into a database, and that's it. If you want to secure that, CSP and SRI will work all day long. You know, if you know where the code lives and when it's released and why it's there and what it changes, and you can automatically generate hashes and everything else, that is a great use case for CSP and SRI. If you have a modern e-commerce website with dozens of dynamic JavaScript integrations from dozens of different servers and vendors across the internet, it's not, that ain't it. It's not, you're gonna hurt yourself trying to do that. And I know, of course, I'm coming from a tool vendor, so like I said, take it or leave it. But I heard from one set of folks like a really long time ago who were trying to implement CSP, and the way they were doing it through headers, which I won't get into why you would do that, but they said our CSP file got so long that it broke the web headers. Like the browser refused to parse the web page because the content of just the CSP alone was so much text. And I was like, I didn't know you could do that. So that's cool. Let's see. So we're coming to the end of our time here. Let's pick out one last kind of topic here to throw in on. I guess, let's see. We've talked about different evidence. We've talked about scope quite a bit. We've talked about urgency and frequency. I guess over the, here's where we'll end up. What's the mood out there, guys, with these requirements? As you're speaking to customers, you know, I've seen personally over the last couple of years, it go from like, oh, this seems like a good idea and we'll get to it. And then over about a year ago in January, like, oh, we really need to do something about this. And I do kind of feel the heat turning up as we get into August and September. And for e-commerce, often you get a code freeze between Black Friday and Christmas and et cetera. As you're speaking to customers, like, what's the mood out there like with web application payment security, just as a closing thought?
Yeah, I can tell you from our side, what we saw initially going into this year, organizations pushing just to understand what they needed to know for 2024. And then as soon as we wrap up, let's start talking about these new requirements. They were aware of them, but they didn't want to invest a lot of time and energy. They want to make sure they're ready for this year. Now we're halfway through the year. We're seeing people now reaching out, vetting vendors, looking for solutions. So not a lot of implementation yet. We've had a few customers that have implemented, but a lot of them are going through we're seeing adoption as far as going through the process and looking for the solution. This process takes a while, especially larger organizations, because you're involving probably your development team, your security team, your compliance team, kind of working together to review these different solutions, as well as maybe still looking at, is there another way outside a third party we can do that, and then come up with a decision. And so that process, I mean, we've had organizations, I think even speaking with you, Matt, or your teams, probably for 6 months now, and they still haven't decided on a solution. So they're getting closer. They're down to that point, but yeah, it takes some time. So organizations, that really want to vet this right, just keep that in mind. It takes some time. You need to start now to probably have that implemented by March of next year.
I would agree with that. There's a lot of customers out there that say that they'll be compliant with the requirement by the time that their next assessment rolls around, but then I remind them that this goes into effect April 1st. You don't have until September of 2025 to become compliant with it. You need to start working on it now in order to get it in place by the time that the requirement goes into effect. I've seen some frustration out there because there's a lot of companies that brought in an iframe, or they're doing a full redirect to reduce their scope, and now there's additional requirements. And like, I know ASV scanning isn't a topic for this, but there's a lot of customers that they reduce their scope as much as possible by introducing an iframe, getting rid of the call center, mail order, stuff like that. And they only have ecom, they use an iframe, and now there's more requirements to comply with. And especially when it's something that they haven't even considered before. It's a little bit frustrating to have to do ASV scans on top of 643 and 1161. But I mean, it just goes into payment security. There's emerging threats and they need to be taken care of. And it's much better to comply with 643, 1161 and ASV scanning than to be on the front page of the New York Times. So it's
Although Matt showed us that could be defaced.
It's only a matter of time before I get
You
a
can
phone
change
call
your own news story if you want.
saying, yeah, you just knock it off with that demo. Gil, any parting thoughts just on what you've heard out in the world about 643 and 1161?
I agree with all the panel members here where, there's just more requirements. And I think if I had to put a word on how our entities are trying to comply with these extra requirements, yeah, they're scared. And I get it. Yeah. There's some fear.
The impact of these requirements, what makes it impacting is the fact that it applies to all merchant levels that do e-com. Yeah. So we're getting even more inquiries from clients or organizations that we normally don't talk to because they don't do rocks, they don't do audits, but they have questions about this. They're trying to find solutions. There's different sectors as well. So big areas of maybe organizations that are really trying to figure this out right now are like state and local governments, these multi-merchant environments where they have hundreds of merchants under their umbrella. Like, how do we do this? What do we implement? Universities, that's another one. They're feeling this challenge and trying to figure out solutions and make them manageable so they have a universal solution across all their merchant portfolio.
Yeah, I think it's obviously everybody is affected, and I think the theme I'd rather, fear, yes, but also getting this under control. I think one of the themes is that you're going to make an actual substantive improvement in the security of your organization. Merchants are going to be stronger and more secure, and their visitors are going to be more capable because of that. There's lots to talk about here. We're over time, so we do have to call it there. I want to thank our panelists so very much for your time and expertise. It's obviously invaluable as folks are navigating this issue. Source Defense does provide solutions for this, and we have to keep the lights on. So if you want to hear about what we do, sourcedefense.com/free-PCI. We have our own tools that are available for free. You can take a look and really get a leg up on inventory and a bunch of other things, even if you don't decide to move forward with us. There's some great value in there, I think, even with no further contact. Again, gentlemen, I want to thank you so very much for your time. We're grateful for your partnership. IBM, A-Lign, Insight, and Optiv, they're all great folks in their field, and I would encourage everybody to reach out to them if you have any further questions about this, which I get the feeling people might have further questions about this. We may be doing this again in the near future. And nonetheless, thanks to our audience for your time and attention. We greatly appreciate it. My name's been Matt, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much.